Hey guys, this is Jay Calderon with Jay Unboxing, giving my immediate reaction to the fight card in Los Angeles on Friday night, headlined by Gilberto Ramirez versus Sullivan Barrera on DAZN. Before we get into that main event there at light heavyweight, we're going to look at the thrilling co-featured bout between Joseph Diaz and Javier Fortuna at 135 pounds. A very competitive fight with Diaz winning some early rounds, but having a kind of point deducted for hitting behind the head and Fortuna pushing kind of hard in those middle frames. Almost felt like Diaz might be a bit behind at that midway point. It was hard to tell just because of so many variables going into that. There was a cut, there's point deductions, you have cleaner work with more work. It's just one of those things where it was a close fight, but ultimately Diaz did rally and probably won 5 out of the last 6 rounds of the fight in order to obtain a unanimous decision victory, his first victory in quite a while, and of course his first victory as well at lightweight. So good debut for the California native. And it felt a little bit like redemption for Diaz, who was able to kind of put some of the issues that he's had more recently behind him a little bit. Of course, he missed weight in his first title defense after beating Tevin Farmer for the title at junior lightweight. It just felt like he was in a situation where he had a lot to prove coming up from 126, then 130, now at 135. He seemed to still have some decent pop, carried the weight pretty well, fought a very game Fortuna, and looked good in all of these sort of aspects. And I think it's just it's a nice fresh start for him because, again, he was not being granted a lot of favors in the boxing community for the last probably year or so, with just being inactive and surprising a lot of people with the Farmer win, only to then spoil that because he seemed to miss weight in his very first defense of that gold. Now, of course, this was in the bubble, and there were no treadmills, no saunas. It was difficult to cut weight, but at the same time, it's just, this is one of those things where people expect professionals to hit weight. And again, as much as we can come up with reasons as to why people miss weight, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of fighters that were in the bubble made weight. So clearly, this is something that was doable. And I think ultimately it created a good reason, a good excuse for Diaz to just move up anyway and now look pretty good, pretty fresh, pretty strong, and really put himself in a position to have a lot of big money fights. I mean, lightweight is loaded. You have everyone from, makeable fights for him with Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney, all the way out to, potential showdowns with the likes of a Lomachenko or a Teofimo Lopez. Now, whether or not he'd be favored in many of these fights, to be perfectly honest with you, kind of remains to be seen. However, at the end of the day, there are still fights there that he can make, and he's a very game fighter in that he does seem to be willing to go through a little bit if he needs to, which is kind of one of the only issues I saw in this fight for him, which is, he has some cuts, he has some wear and tear, but on the one hand, you're pleased that he's willing to go through it, on the other hand, you are kind of curious as to how or whether or not that will catch up with him. But in any event, it always does keep him in a fight. And so seeing him in really any of those matchups, especially the Haney fight, I think would be a very good step for him at this particular point in his career, and would definitely allow for him to put himself in prime position to, be a viable name in a very hot division against an opponent that, in his most recent outing against Jorge Linares, looked vulnerable at times. So certainly a fight that could be made, and that, I think is probably the most winnable for Diaz at the current moment. As far as Fortuna is concerned, he looked very solid, just seems to be a fighter destined to be one step off from the top of the division or the top of the sport at any given time. He's just one of those situations where you think he just might not have quite enough to stay there. He just loses against guys that if you're gonna be at the top of the division, you have to beat these guys. Whether it's a Sosa or whether it's even a Diaz in this case, these are the fights that I think Fortuna should be winning if he is kind of that upper echelon of 135 pounds. Having said that, I will say that he was initially scheduled to face Ryan Garcia this year before Garcia pulled out due to mental health issues. And while that's, clearly understandable, he needs to take care of himself and good for him, I will say Garcia might have dodged one here, because even though he was, the one that came out with the shorter end of the stick in this fight with Diaz, I do think this version of Fortuna still gives Garcia fits. Garcia's a natural puncher, so that's going to give him always a shot, and Fortuna can be hit, but he also is going to be in there, and if you let him hang around long enough, it's going to be one of those situations where I think he could still give Garcia some problems. So it definitely would be a good test for him, and that, at the very least, for Fortuna, gives him one more shot, one more crack at kind of, making his his name at 135 pounds. In any event, moving on here, in the main event, former super middleweight titleist Gilberto Ramirez looked impressive at light heavyweight, stopping Sullivan Barrera in the fourth frame. The first round was relatively quiet, but Ramirez got going with body shots and landed a nice dig to the ribs in the third that dropped the veteran Barrera. He did end up making it out of the round because it was relatively close to the end, but ultimately was dropped twice more in the fourth, and the bout was finally waved off. Now, for Ramirez, of course, there was some good and some bad. I think he pulled back too much after some exchanges. I think he made himself a little more vulnerable to getting hit. And again, he is still moving up. Yes, he's a big bad bastard, but at the end of the day, he still is moving up to a light heavyweight where, once you get to 175 and up in terms of pounds, you can't just let yourself get hit. You can't just pull back and have your chin up in the air. You can't just go for trading shots all the time, because you're talking about, getting close to, especially on the night, you're getting close to 200 pounds of force behind a shot. You just can't take those punches like that. And it didn't come back to haunt him in this fight, but that's something that he's going to have to work on, I think, going forward. On the good side of things, he was patient and seemed to carry his power well enough against someone who was decent at 175. Again, I think Barrera might be a little bit beyond his selling date here, but he's still a decent fighter. He's still technically solid, and Ramirez didn't really seem to have much trouble with him other than the mistakes he himself walked into. Yeah, Ramirez looked pretty good overall. I just think, it's a couple of little things here and there that he may have to tweak if he's going to have the most success possible at 175 pounds. Plan going forward at 175, speaking of which, has to be a showdown with someone like a Dimitri Bivol, I think, which is a fight that could be pretty easy to set up in a potentially winnable fight, which of course could then set up a massive showdown with Canelo Alvarez in the future if and when Canelo decides to move up after potentially unifying 168 pounds. It's just a fight that makes sense. It's very, very sellable. You put this on Cinco de Mayo or Mexican Independence Weekend, and you got yourself a blockbuster fight that a lot of Mexicans are going to look into. And because, in fact, Ramirez is a naturally bigger guy than Canelo and can fight, it would be a good fight and a relatively compelling one, though I do think Canelo probably wins. Still a very sellable, compelling fight. Fight that's probably more winnable for Ramirez is probably a Joe Smith fight, who is also a titleist at 175 pounds, but that's only going to happen if he's a mandatory, because quite frankly, I see no reason why Top Rank, who allowed Ramirez to move over to Golden Boy, is going to effectively give one of their titles over to Ramirez, who quite frankly should be considered the heavy favorite against the Joe Smith. Yes, Smith is a good puncher, but he is far too susceptible to shots. I do favor Ramirez in that fight. Unless he's looking to become the mandatory, that's going to be a much harder fight to make. In any event, does have some options, so it'll be kind of interesting to see what path he and his team take. For Barrera, he's just not a top flight fighter, unfortunately, and he probably at that point where he's going to have to start asking himself some of those serious, tough questions that fighters must ask towards the potential end of their career. He just doesn't quite have enough pop, doesn't quite have enough speed, doesn't have quite enough technical savvy or skill, defensive prowess. He's just a good all-around fighter, but the problem with being a good and only good all-around fighter is that your fade comes quicker because you're coming down off a much less high perch. It's lower to the ground to begin with. So it's a much faster descent, unfortunately, and that kind of looks like where Barrera might be. Kind of in that gatekeeper territory. Though, if he's, getting knocked out in 4 or 5 rounds by Gilberto Ramirez, who's, again, no slouch, but still, in less than a handful of rounds, you're getting beaten up and taken out. It's difficult to see even how much of a gatekeeper you could be. So again, might be time for Barrera to start asking himself some tough questions, unfortunately. In any event, let me know what you guys thought of the card, the event overall, the results, the winners, losers, so on and so forth. Who do you think Ramirez should fight next? Who do you think Joseph Diaz should fight next? Would love to hear your take on that down in the comments below. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at @Calderon_JOB. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Email me at junboxing@gmail.com. And of course, visit junboxing.com for schedule, results, betting odds, so on and so forth. And as always, until next time.